Hello, everyone, and welcome to WOTS Weekly Features. Today's guest is Sarah Dowling, poet and contributor to Coach House Books. We'll be talking about her new poetry book, Entering Sappho. We're also discussing queerness, history, and the legacy of forgotten places. I'm Sienna Tristan, and I'll be your host. WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and allied nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land that you live on, wherever you're tuning in from. So our guest today is Sarah Dowling. Sarah is the author of Down and Security Posture, which received the Robert Koch Award for Innovative Poetry. A literary critic as well as a poet, Sarah's first scholarly book, Translingual Poetics, Writing Personhood Under Settler Colonialism, was a finalist for the American Studies Association's Laura Romero Prize. Sarah is an assistant professor in the Center for Comparative Literature and Victoria College at the University of Toronto. Hello and welcome.
Hi, Sienna. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about this piece of work, and I'm also excited to hear a little bit about it. So would you be able to start us off with a reading?
Definitely. So Sienna put in a request to something from right in the middle of the book, which is a sequence of sonnet-ish poems. And the title of the sequence is This Word I Want. So I'm going to read about 3 of these sonnet-ish poems, one poem that's not, and then back to another one that is. So it's 4 very short poems in a little sequence, and you probably won't be able to tell by listening which is a sonnet and which is not, but I figured I would flag it because some people really, really like sonnets. So here's This Word I Want. Tell us about the Mediterranean realm and the visions of their American patrons. Tell us about the hollow peak of Mount Olympus and the frontier by which we exceed it. In these ancient and modern times, we've done so many things. Teach us about the thick swarm of gods and the 50 Albions, our own kleptographic hands, and our vicious greed for beauty. Teach us to believe that these names were plucked from our best dormant traits, pulled from a belt of elusive gods who personify the evening. Teach us to run our snow fingers down the valleys of blue waste. Show us how to lap the warm, wet edges of possession sound. In our period of birth and consolidation, daughter colonies open, spread outward. We have recorded 2,405 classical names scoring the rocks, pounding the flanks of these northern peripheral zones. A rural settlement pattern, a belt in the shape of a bent isosceles. This migration front is thick with fresh adoptions. We're filling in the holes. We are a pattern of blotches across this uniform nutrient medium. Orem, Cyprum, Eureka, college towns bravely christened Exotica, decorate these resinous slopes and mountain basins. A zodiac of ancient characters documents our extroverted buoyancy, our scatter over soft and bushy lands. Mythological personages supplement lively post offices. What they most resemble is a pantheon of hungry dogs. What they most resemble is an advanced stage of a bacterial culture. What we most resemble is the end of the world. We are conspicuous. We pluck the strings of historical association and make another exclusion. We are a winnowing, a slow tick of the intellectual pacemaker, a growing edge. Wait till they get up close. This movement happened in more than 100 cities: Agricola, Bovina, Pomona, Marathon, Akron, Ajax, Salix, and others extending in a long line below the wet cloud blanket. This terrible red gash was turning red like it was forgotten, like the pluckers forgot. Somehow the pickers forgot it, the harvesters missed or forgot somehow, and your vision dimmed with tears, with it reddening high at the tip, but you missed it, being out of reach. You didn't notice, rather you did notice, but the apple pickers forgot. You missed, the pluckers forgot it. No, you didn't miss, no, not forgot. We plot and interpret the practice of memorializing some imagined ancient world. We place symbols on the map, post-date archaic expansions so that their margins in space, time, and information become concerning. We place the weight of the heavens on our shoulders and don a principal belt of plantation agriculture. Trace a triangle with its apex east of Syracuse and call it a foray into terra incognita. Hang cities like Blue Scalp Vales, Eros in Louisiana and Arizona, Troy's To Lose for a Kiss, convulsive surges forward as traits of national character. We cultivate some vulnerable spot on our bodies and establish towns for heartbreak, the old Greek Strait, the inland sea, the wild peninsula.
Thank you so much. The Wild Peninsula. I love it. Everyone, run, go get your copies now. So there's a lot to unpack here. Would you, now that we've had a little taste of what's sort of like really in the book, in the dead center, like you were saying, can you tell us a little bit about what went into writing Entering Sappho? I don't want to, not quite what it's about, but like what are the different influences and the different practices that you engaged in while writing this thing?
For sure. So just to give a slight bit of the what it's about before I launch into the other stuff, because it might help it make a little more sense. Mm-hmm. So I used to live in Seattle, and a good friend of mine, the fiction writer Rebecca Brown, always said to me, oh, you have to go out to the Olympic Peninsula. It's so beautiful. Mm. And when you do that, you're going to drive past an important part of our queer heritage, which is this road sign that says Entering Sappho, because there used to be a town named Sappho. It is not there anymore. There's not a single building. You'd never know anything had ever been there. But the great big road sign that, you know, like entering Toronto, entering Hamilton, entering Sappho is still there. So it's kind of a sort of minor tradition to go take a picture with it. So I thought, like, okay, that sounds fun. I'll do that. And then when I did, I just thought, like, you know, there's a lot more here than just a funny road sign that's kind of like a crude sexual / literary pun. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of couldn't stop thinking about that. And I started doing all this research into the history of that town, reading the poet Sappho's work more, and also kind of looking into this broader phenomenon of naming places after places in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, which there's a little bit of that in Canada, like Ajax, you may have heard in one of the lists in one of those poems there, but it's a much more prominent phenomenon in the US. And so I was kind of reading all this stuff and trying to make sense of it, and I wasn't really sure what to say about any of it, so I started sort of jamming it together and collaging it together in different ways. So much of what you heard in those poems is drawn from a scholarly article from the 1950s or 60s that's about this phenomenon of naming places in the US after places in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And a lot of the language that seems perhaps the most critical of settler colonialism actually comes from his article, and he didn't really intend it that way. He was just trying to think of metaphors for how you could picture how you can kind of track westward movement of colonists through the naming of these places, because all the names start sort of in Western New York State and then
spread.
Yeah. So all these images that he uses to help you picture that and understand it are like, well, if you picture bacteria spreading across
an advanced stage of bacterial culture, yeah.
Exactly. So this kind of petri dish image, which I think is a great one for the kind of like moral resonance, and that was just something that he had as a sort of throwaway to sort of be like, you know, how it blobs outward in little blobs. So I just found all of these sources very interesting to kind of put alongside one another, because something that seemed sort of neutral or descriptive in one context had a totally different resonance when it was put up against something else. So a lot of the kind of sexual metaphors from Sappho, when they're put up against something like that, they get like a tinge of horror to them. So I was interested in thinking through how the kind of practice of bringing together these radically different documents that are not talking about the same thing at all, but have this sort of almost funny point of connection because of the name Sappho, might give us sort of a different lens through which to look at some of these problems, or might give us just a different set of tools for thinking about some questions that are kind of familiar, like these questions around memorializing things that are perhaps actually quite shameful and horrific. That there might be a way of thinking about why are they shameful and why are they horrific in a slightly different resonance or with a slightly different approach.
Definitely. And I find it so fascinating that you chose poetry as the medium through which to do this exploration and this like deep pondering, especially again, found poetry. How so much of this has been excerpted from these articles, these academic papers, Sappho's own poetry as well, that's sort of retranslating and rejigging it. So can you talk a little bit about your use of poetry as a medium through which to carry these thinkings? Like, how does it lend itself to telling the story differently than perhaps something a little bit more prosy or academic, as you've done academic but work before?
For sure, yeah. And I think every genre sort of gives you a different conversation to be a part of. So when you're writing your academic article, you're probably mostly speaking to other people who also write academic articles. Or when you're writing your op-ed in the newspaper, you're speaking to a kind of general everyone, insofar as everyone does that, right? But when you're speaking through poetry, you might be speaking to quite a small audience. I think that's often one of the kind of concerns, right? Is that there's a sort of like niche quality to poetry, or that, it just doesn't perhaps broadcast as widely as, say, a best-selling novel or whatever the other
listicle.
For instance, exactly. But I will say that for all of that concern, I have found poetry to be a place where very unexpected conversations can happen. And I think it's partly because poetry attracts quite a grab bag audience. When in COVID times, it's harder to remember this, but when I used to, back in the day, there were lots of poetry readings. It's not all the same type of person at a poetry reading. It's the kind of unusual group of people, different ages, different backgrounds, different jobs that people have, but they all come together around this sort of common interest. And they all seem to be quite excited about thinking about things in an unusual way. So I found, over the years that many of the most kind of politically radical conversations I want to have involved, they haven't necessarily been exclusively among poets, but they've involved a lot of poets, because poetry is sort of a place that we go to think really deeply about a problem and perhaps like find a strange way into the problem. But it's also necessarily something that we have to share with other people. Like, one can, of course, just write it in one's diary, but it doesn't sort of fully become, I think, poetry until you go to a reading or a performance, or you publish it in a journal, or you post it online somewhere. For me, that's sort of when the poem really sort of takes flight, is when it's shared with other people. So even though it might seem like perhaps a sort of non-obvious genre in which to have a conversation that's in some way political, I've always found that poets are really eager for that conversation, really ready to think about things that might seem difficult or weird or uncomfortable even. So I found that poetry is actually a great place to puzzle through a problem with other people, even though it sometimes seems like, aren't you just talking about flowers or whatever?
No, there's depth here, promise.
Yeah.
Yeah, poetry as a medium for puzzling is definitely something that I will keep in mind, because that tracks with why I read poetry as well. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I don't think many people who really read poetry beyond like a Hallmark card are turning to it to just like have one good feeling and move on. I think a lot of people who read lots of poetry or read poetry consistently, they turn to it because it makes them think about things and it brings them up against something that they're not used to confronting, and that's what they want from poetry. So for me, poetry is really wonderful for puzzling through our most sort of persistent problems. So although it may not seem natural to everyone, it seems natural to me.
So to speak of like toothy sort of, interesting things to chew on through this poetry, I would love to hear about how the legacies of forgotten places play a role in entering Sappho. Like, is the setting of Sappho, the abandoned town that doesn't even exist there anymore, is that a character in and of itself in this work? Like, how does place and geography play into this exploration?
I think that's a great question. For me, there was something really quite hopeful about the fact that this town doesn't exist anymore, because I think especially when we're talking about a huge issue like settler colonialism, it can seem just completely intractable. Like, how would we ever have something other than what we have now if this is sort of the entire world as we know it, or our piece of the entire world as we know it? But for me, the idea that this town existed and now doesn't,
Yeah.
Even though I'm not saying like burn down society in every aspect, but it's over. Like whatever that was is finished. And now other life forms exist there, and plenty of people live in the region. It's not that settler colonialism came to an end there or something like that, but just symbolically, there was something quite hopeful about the sense that like this was actually a very brief period of time, like really less than 100 years. And, especially thinking of Sappho, like in the span of the time from when she was writing her poems to right now, Sappho the town is like barely a blip on the radar. So there was something to me that was kind of exciting about that, like sort of putting together these different time scales as a way to sort of think about these things that seem so inescapable or too big to change, or just hard to imagine your way outside of, that there was something about this town that sort of flashed up the possibility of other possibilities. And kind of in a weird way, because of course Sappho can be taken as like, oh, the greatness of Western culture, universal literature. That's not necessarily my perspective on it, but many try to use ancient Greek classics that way.
Yeah.
So I think I'm kind of talking in circles around your question.
No, for sure.
Really, like the symbolism of the place was even more interesting to me than the actual place. And I have joked with other people like that maybe I should have written a slightly different book, because I'm not actually from there. Like I'm from Regina, so I could certainly have done something with that as well, but it just didn't seem quite so interesting. And with Sappho, there's a sort of tie-in, like why poetry as the way to address it too. Like, I think especially for kind of queer poets, like we want to sort of say like, oh, Sappho's ours, like this is our thing. And I think that cuts both ways, right? Like what parts of it are you trying to claim, and what parts of it are you pretending you don't exist so you can claim it?
Yeah.
But then also, like, what does that sort of make possible? What are the kind of unforeseen ways that we might use this legacy as a form of critique, or as a way of understanding our own particular locations, even in a very like literal sense? Like, normally we wouldn't say like read Antigone and understand why you live in the Danforth. Good, I don't know, right? Like these texts kind of never close in that way. So there's a certain set of possibilities with just continuing to push on them, continuing to use those legacies that we have that have come to us to sort of reinterpret the world we're living in.
And they're in conversation kind of forever, like you were saying.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you brought up the queerness, because I definitely want to inquire a little bit about how your own queerness and your identity informs how you approach this. Because, there's the big, interesting puzzling of the settler colonialism and like how a Greek name comes to a continent that it was not all of this. But there's also the road sign and the rite of passage. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So with the road sign, I guess there used to be something kind of like the Lesbian Herstory Archives in Seattle, and they had a lot of pictures of people in front of this road sign that kind of went back over the decades, and that archive is not there anymore, and I'm actually not sure what happened to it. But my friend Rebecca, who's like very well known herself as like a queer experimental fiction writer, like a couple of generations older than me, so she kind of like told me about all of this. So it was kind of, oh, this like lore is getting passed down and I'm so happy to receive it. And this is kind of community in action. So there was like the positive sense of it in that regard, right? Like being sort of brought into a kind of shared knowledge. But then around the same time as I started reading or preparing to write this book and doing the research for it, there was this article in the New York Times about like an intentional community of white queers who had sort of set themselves up on the Olympic Peninsula, so near-ish to Sappho, but very like pioneer style. And I just was so disturbed in reading it that there was like, and perhaps it just wasn't in the article and they were totally doing great things, I have no clue. As it was presented in the article, it was just very like going back to pioneer times to find a safe way to be queer. And I was like, for whom?
Yeah.
Like it just seems so repetitive and so sort of willfully unconcerned with issues of land and issues of sovereignty, and so unreflective on the kind of like gleeful repetition of these kind of pioneering ideals that I just thought like being queer doesn't give us a pass on
It sure don't.
So that was something that I was really wanting to kind of drill into with this book, is on the one hand, there's this sort of set of strategies that either kind of white people in general or white queers in particular can sort of use as like escape hatches or like to exonerate ourselves or to kind of sidestep things that we want to suggest that we're not really a part of. And, of course, I think one falls into that here and there because nobody's perfect and, it can be very uncomfortable to think of one's own complicity. So I certainly don't mean to suggest that I've found a way out of that. But I thought there was an interesting way that in thinking through the sort of Sappho poetry, Sappho place connection, it was not so easy to just scoot to the side. And that actually kind of putting Sappho in a way absurdly into this situation, although in fact, of course, that is what the
quite literally just, yeah.
That's exactly what happened. So to actually just sort of take that on and take that as the starting point might offer a different sort of way of locating oneself, whether like me as the writer trying to weave these threads together and sort of puzzle through some of these questions around complicity, but maybe also for someone else as the reader to sort of see the way that I braided those things together and then think about it in their own way as well. That there's something to kind of pass along the work and sort of ask other people to make their own meaning from this connection. Like rather than the classic Wayne Kang called these settler moves to innocence, like this might make it harder to pretend to be innocent or even to move out of the way in a certain sense. So I thought for me that was a useful thing to spend some time with, and I hope for other people it might similarly be sort of provocative.
Definitely. If people wanted to extend their search beyond entering Sappho once they've sat with that information for a little while, do you have any recommendations for other works, if poetry, creative nonfiction, even academic works, that they might be able to do that with, to pursue that with?
Yeah, for sure. So one book that it's actually a section of a book that I've found really interesting recently, is there's actually an adaptation of Antigone that's called Antigone by Beth Piatote. So she's Nez Perce, so she's Indigenous herself, and she has kind of rewritten an Indigenous Antigone that really is kind of puzzling through many similar problems. I wouldn't say exactly the same, but I've been thinking about her play a lot recently because part of the adaptation is that the play takes place in an anthropology museum. And it has to do with, so in Antigone, right, the whole problem is Antigone, the main character, her brother was killed in a battle, and the king says nobody can bury him because his corpse is sort of going to show everyone else not to have a rebellion or whatever. And so when Beth Piatote moves the setting into the anthropology museum, then the question sort of shifts a bit, and it becomes about how we honor the bodies of dead people. And there are many dead people, as we know from recent events, not only sort of imprisoned in museums and universities and other research institutions, but more broadly, there are all kinds of people who have not been given proper burial, who have not been returned to their communities, as we've seen very recently in Canada. Unfortunately, this is something that's really just incredibly widespread. So this play really gives us a sort of lens on thinking through these problems. And it doesn't present a simple solution. Like, as with Antigone, there are kind of clashing perspectives among the characters, but all of them actually share an insistence that, these people who are deceased are very much ongoing members of our communities to whom we owe obligations.
Yeah.
So we can think about that certainly in the context of how the members of Indigenous communities have been treated after death, but reading it sort of a couple of months ago, more in like the height of one of our worst COVID waves, I also was just thinking that like, this is a question we can ask across any number of different areas of social life, is like, who do we actually kind of push to the side and expose to premature death, and who is treated as though their death is, simply an inconvenience or a kind of thing that society moves on from. So for me, that play, it had some interesting resonances with my book, but I would say it asked much more biting and important questions. So within a book called The Bead Workers, that has a number of short stories, but that play, which is within the collection, The Bead Workers, for me, it was like one of the most astounding works of literature that I've read in the past few years, and I strongly recommend it to everyone. It's from Counterpoint Press.
One more time,
from Counterpoint Press.
Counterpoint Press. You heard it here first, folks. Walk, don't run. Well, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely smashing half hour. I've really enjoyed listening to your thoughts and the way that you've developed this piece, and then all of the sort of deep thinking that's going to pour out of it over time, because it's not done. Again, these things are a conversation forever. So I am very excited to well, excited's a weird word, but I'm looking forward to doing my own thinking with it. And I thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great chatting with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my work, talk about other people's work, hear your questions. It's been really wonderful.
Have a great afternoon, Sarah.
You too. Thank you so much. Bye, Sienna.
Bye.
Bye.
And thank you all at home for having a listen with us. To check out Sarah's poetry, including Entering Sappho, and for more Coach House titles, you can go to chbooks.com. This has been today's WOTS Weekly Feature. You can tune in tomorrow for a conversation about intergenerational mentorship and systems of care with Saul Friedman Lawson from Shameless Magazine. For discounts and deals, check out toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca/weekly-features. And from all of us at WOTS, happy Pride Week.